Good morning. I hate to be the one to break up the fellowship and the social interaction, but Wally will yell at me if I start late, so we'll go ahead and get started. Let's see. We're on week 12 of our Genesis study, and as I told Wally, I'm going to break ranks a little bit with what the class asked of us. So the workbook has us doing the first half of chapter 50, but in my opinion, chapters 48 and 49 are as significant, if not more so, than chapter 50. So I didn't want to hand wave chapters 48 and 50, so we're going to do that this week, and the next week we'll do all of chapter 50 together. So that'll be kind of our focus for this morning. So a little bit of our art history iconography. It didn't show up real well on the screen, but this is a Rembrandt Van Rijn painting of Jacob blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, which is our study this morning. And if you can see Jacob, Rembrandt was known for his uncompromising realism. He wasn't really much of a classicalist. He didn't paint these bright, happy pictures. He tried to focus on realistic features. And if you can kind of make out Jacob's, he's old and wizened and humped over, barely able to sit up on the bed. His eyes are dark and dim with age. He's 147 years old at this point. And but you see him reaching out, the significant act of reaching his hands out on the heads of his grandchildren as he adopts them as his own. Asenath is Joseph's wife there in the background. And of course, they've all got Western European features, but we'll forgive Rembrandt for that because he was Dutch. But anyway, interesting to visualize that scene that we're going to study this morning. So what I want to do this morning is I will do a summary of chapter 48, and then we'll read 49 together, and then talk about it. So chapter 48, Jacob is on his deathbed. He is at the end of his life, and he knows it. When he was 130, when he was a young man, 130 years old, he also kind of thought he was on his deathbed, remember? But hearing about Joseph being alive, seeing Joseph alive in Egypt, revived his spirit. And so Jacob has been given another 17-ish years on the earth. But now he's really approaching the end, 147 years old. We read in chapter 48 and verse 3, verse 2, that he summoned his strength. He rallied his strength to sit up on the bed. And I think that's a significant marker of what he's about to do. So Joseph knows Jacob is ill, and he brings his two sons with him to go to see their grandfather Jacob, the great patriarch. And I don't know that Joseph knows the momentous occasion, the momentous thing that's about to happen. I think grandsons, we're going to go see your grandfather one more time before he passes. And so Jacob sits up on the bed, and he says, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And then he reiterates the promise that God made to him when Jacob was fleeing Esau. I mean, this must have been 100 years before, 120 years before or something. When Jacob was fleeing Esau after he stole the birthright, he's fleeing. And in the wilderness, God appears to him and reiterates that promise, the covenantal promise that he made to Abraham and Isaac. He made that same promise to Jacob. And Jacob begins his discourse with a reminder of that promise, because it's important, because what he's about to say to Ephraim and Manasseh, because that's the covenant he's about to pass on. And so he reminds them of that great event that happened to him. And so he says in verse 5, now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are mine. And that's significant because he lists Ephraim first. Manasseh was the older brother, but he says Ephraim and Manasseh. And then he says they will be mine as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Reuben and Simeon were his first and second children. Ephraim and Manasseh will be the same as Reuben and Simeon. And he's about to explain this, and he's kind of hinting at what he's going to do here. He says, all the children that you father after them shall be yours, but those two are going to belong to me. Those two will be counted as my sons. The same as all my other sons. Those two shall be mine. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. And then he says in verse 7, he reminds Joseph about his beloved wife Rachel, how she died in the wilderness. And, it seems kind of an odd interjection, but I think what he's saying is, these grandsons are special. These are the offspring of my beloved son Joseph, who was the offspring of my beloved wife Rachel. Jacob always, and right or wrong, I don't know, but for whatever reason, Rachel was it. Rachel was all he really cared about in life. And when she passed, it left a big hole in his heart. When Joseph was killed, it left an even bigger hole in his heart. And now he's reminding him of that precious wife Rachel, the one he worked 14 years for. Reminding him, and that is part of the reason that now his two grandsons, the offspring of Rachel, the descendants of Rachel, will be included in this promise. In fact, preeminent in the promise. They won't just be the 11th and 12th sons of Jacob. They will be the first and second sons of Jacob because of Rachel. And so then Jacob asks Joseph, he says, "Who are these two you brought with you?" And that's a sign, not, I think, that he doesn't know who they are, he doesn't care who they are, he can't see. He has the impression there's two people over here with Jacob, and he says, "Who are these? Is this Ephraim and Manasseh?" And Joseph said, "Yes, these are my sons, Ephraim and Manasseh." And so he says, "Bring them over to me that I may bless them." And here we see in verse 10, "Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so he could not see. So Joseph brought them near, and Jacob kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph," in one of these, again, kind of interjected, heartwarming little asides, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Jacob is an old man at the end of his life, but a happy man at the end of his life, I think. I mean, he is overwhelmed with how grateful he is that not only he got his son Joseph back, but now he gets to see his grandchildren too. This is an emotional scene for Jacob and for Joseph, I think. And then Joseph, so Jacob says, "Bring them up so I can bless them." And Joseph brings up his two sons, and he puts them so that Manasseh, the older one, is under Jacob's right hand, and Ephraim is under his left hand. Because the right hand you bless the firstborn. That's the preeminent blessing. And Jacob goes like this. And he puts his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh. And Joseph becomes very distressed by this. And he says, no, Father, you've got it backwards. And Jacob says, "I know what I'm doing." As dim as his eyes may be, the old man is still pretty sharp. And so he puts his right hand on the head of Ephraim. And you wonder why he does this a little bit. I mean, we're not told kind of explicitly why. I wonder if it had something to do with the fact that Jacob was the youngest that received the blessing over his older brother. Was he just kind of sympathetic to that fact and wanted to kind of do that again? Did he have some kind of divine, spiritual, inspired knowledge of that Ephraim needs to be the blessed one and Manasseh not? I don't know. But for whatever reason, he blesses Ephraim the younger over Manasseh the older. And then he blesses Joseph. And he says kind of a beautiful short prayer here. "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life, long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys. And in them let my name be carried on, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." And that's the blessing he gives to these two sons. Ephraim blessed ahead of Manasseh. "His younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." And he says, Manasseh is going to be a great nation, don't worry. But Ephraim's going to be greater. And again, he doesn't explicitly say kind of why, but that's what he does. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. And then Israel says to Joseph, "Behold, I'm about to die. But God will be with you and bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow." Kind of a marker of, Joseph's portion is going to be a little bit better because of who Joseph is and what Joseph has done for the family, quite honestly. And then that concludes chapter 48. You can see why I didn't want to skip this. Because Ephraim and Manasseh, for one thing, it precedes everything in 49, which is Jacob kind of doling out, I'll call them blessings for lack of a better word, on his other sons. But as we'll see, they're not really blessings. But Ephraim and Manasseh came first. He dealt out this blessing, this prediction, this prophetic word first. And it bears a lot of significance for the history of Israel, at least up through about the time of David. So pretty historically significant, spiritually significant act here. Any other comments about 48 before we go ahead and read our text for the morning? I put up a timeline. I like timelines. This kind of shows the ages of where all the patriarchs were at any given moment. So you can see Abraham, when Abraham died at 175 years old, Jacob was about 15 to 20 years old. So Jacob would have had some real experiences with Abraham. You can see Isaac was 180 years old when he died. So Isaac was alive when Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt. We don't usually think about that because it's written kind of linearly, right? We read about Abraham, then we read about Isaac, then we read about Jacob. But a lot of these events overlap. And so if you look at the ages and the timeline, it's kind of interesting to think in those terms. Anyway, I find it interesting. Joseph died in about 1805, just a date to keep in mind. And then Moses was born about 1526 BC. That's the date that I found. So not quite 300 years later, from Joseph to Moses. All right, let's read chapter 49 together. And we'll start right up here in front. Ma'am, whenever you're ready. We'll start in 40. We're going to read 49 this morning. Yes, ma'am. Verses. That's great. Thank you.
Issachar.
His rod won't donkey, lying down between two saddlebags. When he sees how good is his resting place, and how pleasant is his land, he will then go over the river and even towards the river. Dan will cry just towards the people, and when the cries of Israel. Dan will be served by the little side, I alone the path, and I towards the fields, and as riding from the pasture. I will look near the river of the Lord. God will be attacked by an enemy, and he will attack them in their fields. Ashes blue will be rich, he will provide delicacies fit for a king.
Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty One who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph, and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with the blessing suitable to him. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Genesis chapter 49. I wonder how this story was passed on, kind of, the oral history of the Hebrew people. If they often recalled the day that Jacob described each one of his sons and each one of the tribes. And he not only kind of gave them a prediction of what they'd be like in the future, it was an assessment of their character now. There's certainly some divine prophetic power behind his statements, but there's also this kind of very personal description of each one of his sons and what he thinks their people, their descendants are going to be like. And so I wonder how this oral history was kind of passed down. Of course, we have, Moses recording these words, Moses passing on these words to the Israelites. But for that 250, 300 years before Moses, were these things often called up, the blessing of Jacob on each of his sons. Anyway, I think about that because, this is when you go back and you read the Old Testament, from here to, the fall of the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, you can go back and you can read when you hear the Gadites did this, or the son of Issachar did this, and you go back and you kind of read these assessments, and they all kind of correlate to what Jacob's assessments were. You can see the character of these sons played out in the future, and it's kind of interesting to do that. And we'll go through that a little bit as we look through each of these sons. So I called this Jacob blesses his sons. And that's kind of the assessment put at the end of 49 there. Jacob gives the blessing to his sons. But they don't sound like blessings to me. Most of them don't. They sound more like curses, don't they? Some of them are kind of neutral. Some of them are very positive. Joseph is obviously very positive. Judah is very positive. But some of them are just, so Reuben. Look at Reuben first. Jacob begins, assemble and listen to Israel your father. He doesn't say, I'm going to bless you. He says, listen to what's going to happen to you. And then he says, Reuben, you are my firstborn. And he goes on and he kind of describes he was the proof of my power. He was my firstborn son, preeminent. And you wonder if Reuben kind of like puffs out his chest a little bit, he's the firstborn son, and I'm not a firstborn, so I can't relate to this feeling. But my older brother, he's the firstborn, and so I wonder if he takes a lot of pride in being the oldest one of the family. In fact, the other year at Christmas, he said something. He said we were all gathered around, and he said, "Just think, 39 years ago there was just 3 of us." He thinks he's funny, but you wonder if Reuben has that kind of pride in himself. And but then Jacob says, "Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence." Because why? Because you went up on your father's bed and defiled my couch. You defiled my bed. You defiled my marriage bed. And if you remember back to Genesis 34, I think it is, Reuben had gone up and lain with one of Jacob's concubines or wives. And I won't get into all that stuff. But one of Jacob's wives, Reuben went into. And it was a play to consolidate his own power, his own preeminence, his own something. I don't know why. But for whatever reason, and I don't know how long it's been since that happened. I mean, Jacob, it's been at least 40 years since that happened. Maybe much longer. I don't know exactly. But at least 40 years since that happened. And so Reuben is blacklisted from the promise. He'll never work in this town again. And if you look at the history of Reuben throughout the Old Testament, as far as I know, there's not a judge, there's not a prophet, there's not a king that comes out of Reuben. Reuben gets nothing. Reuben fades into obscurity. The once great firstborn reduced to nothing by this one promise of Jacob. I read some commentaries that describe this turbulent as waters, unstable as waters, whatever your translation might say, that frothy like waters. Some say, is it like a pot bubbling over? Reuben was like this pot that's just, it's just turbulent and it's boiling over, and then you see his kind of wickedness, emotion, whatever, boiling out of him. Or is he like a slippery stream, kind of untrustworthy? All of those are kind of true, but for whatever reason, Reuben loses his place. And I don't know if the brothers knew that Jacob had already blessed Ephraim and Manasseh the way he had. I don't know if they knew that, or if they just thought, that's just kind of a generic blessing on his grandsons. He adopted them, sure, whatever. I'm still Reuben. I'm still the oldest. Maybe. I don't know. But Reuben loses out here because of that sin he committed so long ago. Simeon and Levi are brothers, and I think brothers not just in the sense that they're literal brothers, they are brothers in the sense that they are brothers in crime. They are partners in crime. And again, there's a reference back to an event when Dinah, Jacob's daughter, was raped. Her 2 brothers, Simeon and Levi, went up to Shechem, and they slaughtered the Shechemites. They slaughtered them for that. And they did it kind of deceitfully. And so Jacob's assessment is, and I'm not going to, again, get into how I would handle that situation if my sister was raped. I'm not here to judge their action, but Jacob clearly sees when these 2 guys are together, bad things happen. They are violent together. They are unstable together. He says, "Oh, my glory, be not joined to their company, for in their anger they killed men, and they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce." And then he says, "I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." And I'll skip ahead a little bit. I have a map here of the tribes. Most of you are probably familiar with this. See where Simeon is? The very bottom of the map. In fact, if you go back and read Joshua, Simeon's whole tribe was taken within Judah. It was a part of Judah. Simeon didn't really have his own land. So, and again, was this part of was Joshua and Moses, were they aware of these promises that Jacob made? I think so. And they remembered. And they said, "Simeon, you and Levi are going to be scattered. Simeon, we're going to tuck you away in the very bottom. Look where Beersheba is. You go any farther, you hit Egypt." So Simeon's way down there, part of Judah, where Judah, the big strong brother tribe, will kind of insulate them and contain them. And then where's Levi on the map? Well, we know where Levi is on the map. The Levites were scattered in all the 48 cities of Israel because they were the priests. They didn't have their own land. And so Jacob's promise very effectively fulfilled for these two guys. Never again will these two guys be able to collaborate. And there, as I mentioned, there's a couple of other examples. You can see this. In the Song of Moses from Deuteronomy 33, Simeon is never mentioned. All the other tribes are mentioned. Simeon is never mentioned. In Numbers 25, Phinehas, a Levite, kills a Simeonite. You know, there's just these little historical kind of events that kind of reiterate what Jacob predicted here. So we got Reuben, we got Simeon, we got Levi. Who's next? We got Judah. And Jacob is going in birth order. And now he hits Judah. And Judah's promise is pretty remarkable compared to the others. Right off the bat, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. And, you know, I recall back in Genesis 27, when Isaac blessed Jacob, albeit Jacob's deceitfulness is what got him the blessing. But in Genesis 27, verse 29, Isaac says to Jacob, let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. And you see Jacob kind of remembered that, I'm sure. 130 years earlier, Jacob blessed him, and now Jacob is passing on the same kind of language, the same kind of blessing on to Judah, the one he has now chosen for special rights and special privileges in the inheritance. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? And this is where we get that great verse in Revelation 5, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. That's where that language comes from, is right here. Because lions are not kind of this univocal symbol in the Bible. Lions are sometimes good, sometimes bad. They're always something powerful. They're always something fierce. And Jacob uses it here to describe Judah as this powerful force. Maybe even there's a little bit of David in here who comes from Judah. David who killed the lions with his sling, killed the bears with his sling. Maybe there's a little bit of that in here too. And then verse 10. Verse 10 is a great verse. Verse 10 is a very confusing verse in some ways, but the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Until tribute comes. Some translations say until Shiloh comes. Some translations say until he to whom it belongs comes. Commentators and translators have argued over that verse for centuries as to exactly how to translate Shiloh. If you translate it Shiloh, which is I think what the old King James does, you can look at Shiloh as a significant place in history. Shiloh is on the map, up in Ephraim. Again, there's some significance there. North of Bethel. And Shiloh was a very significant place. It was a place of worship. It was a holy place. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it was bad. There was, throughout their history, sometimes there was idolatry there. But Shiloh was a very central kind of important place. And so maybe there's some meaning there that we could pull out until Shiloh comes, until the center of God's worship comes, maybe. Even though commentators and translators argue about how to actually verbalize this verse, all of them agree that this is clearly a messianic prophecy. It is messianic in nature. This verse is pointing to the Messiah. It is pointing to Jesus Christ. All of them agree on that. Until tribute comes to him, until he to whom it belongs comes. And I think that's my favorite translation. The scepter, the ruler's staff shall not leave from between his feet until he to whom it belongs comes. And this is predictive a little bit of Judah as being the heir of the throne of Israel. Maybe. David was the king, right? David's line was the royal line. But regardless of all that stuff that happens between this promise and Jesus, all that royal lineage, the scepter, staff, ultimately it was pointing to the Messiah. Ultimately it was pointing to the time when he to whom the scepter staff really belongs until he comes. And that's what Jacob is saying here. Incredible verse. I don't know why the workbook skipped chapter 49. I don't know. This has been called one of the most significant passages in the Bible. These blessings and these curses of Jacob right here. Not only for the historical importance, but also for the theological importance of what Jacob is saying here. Until he to whom it belongs comes. The ruler's staff from between his feet. Interesting side note. Feet is sometimes euphemistic for male body parts. And so essentially he's saying his descendants, until the ruler's staff will not leave between his legs, from his descendants, from his offspring, until it comes. And there's a few examples of feet being used like that in Judges and elsewhere. And so I think that's what that's saying. Verse 11, binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. There's a lot of messianic language in here. And I won't try and sort out all of it or chop all of it up, but I am the vine, ye are the branches. Jesus came riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, on a colt. I think there's a lot in there. And of course, wine means abundance. Wine, even if we can kind of sort out what exactly it's saying, wine is almost always a symbol for abundance and excess and great wealth and great prosperity. And so here it is again. He's referencing Judah. He washed his garments in wine. And not because he wanted all of his garments to look red or stain them. It's because he had so much wine, he could use it for his wastewater. He could wash his garments in wine. That's how much wine he has. His eyes are darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. I read a few different opinions of that. I think the idea is essentially, again, it's wealth and its prosperity. Some have said it's almost geographic in its description, that the mountains of Judah were rich with vineyards and wine fields, and the valleys were full of wheat and sheep, white wheat, white sheep. And so his eyes are dark and his teeth are white. I don't know. I think that's from some of the Jewish Targum, so take it for what it's worth. But anyway, that is prosperity, that is abundance, that is wealth. And that is what Judah is being predicted to have in the future. Yeah, great stuff. And I debated saying anything about this, but the scepter shall not depart from Judah. They weren't supposed to have a king. Remember, God told them, you don't need a king. You have me. I'm going to send you judges that'll serve as kind of leaders for you because you want leaders. But remember, Israel always clamored for a king. They clamored for a king for good reasons, because they wanted to be like the nations around them. And so I'm not too set on the fact that Jacob is necessarily saying David will become a king because that's what I'm predicting in this holy way. I don't know. I don't want to kind of, butt heads with God's intent there. So I don't know that, I think the main point is the Messiah is the king, and that's the king that Jacob is pointing towards. That's the king that will come from Judah. Yes, ma'am. Yes. 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 That's a good question. And there's a little bit of conflict here between Ephraim and Judah now. Because Ephraim's now the firstborn, right? And if you go read 1 Chronicles 5, it specifically says, Reuben lost the firstborn rights, Ephraim got the firstborn rights, but Judah was still the line of kings. And you kind of ask yourself, well then what's the point of being firstborn? But if you look at Ephraim and the history of Ephraim, he kind of lost it along the way. Not Ephraim personally, but his tribe lost it. They lost those rights at some point along the way. And David, during the time of David, I think Psalm 78 is one of David's psalms. And Psalm 78 describes Ephraim losing that privilege. And that privilege of firstborn now coming to Judah. And so Jacob's promises and his blessings kind of leave room for both options. Again, God weaves free will throughout his plan. And even though God predicts exactly what's going to happen and has an exact plan in mind, how humans get there, and that's the complexity of free will, these guys make choices. Descendants of Ephraim make choices, and those choices have consequences. God's plan is still fulfilled. But I think, I wrestled with that for a long time. Ephraim versus Judah. And in fact, a lot of times when the kingdom is divided, they refer to the northern kingdom as Ephraim and the southern kingdom as Judah. Even though this was Judah and Benjamin, and this was Ephraim, Manasseh, and all of them. Ephraim became the icon for the northern tribe of Israel. Judah became the icon for the southern tribe of Israel once they divided. So if I listed all the references that I tried to read to understand this, we would be here a long time. But you're spot on, and that's a great question, and I had the same question myself. Great, good thoughts. And then, so that kind of concludes Judah, and then we get to Zebulun, and he's still going in order. I think Issachar is actually the older brother, but he puts Zebulun first, and no one really knows why, so I don't know why either. But Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea. Again, we can, where's Zebulun? Kind of at the shore of the sea. He had access to the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall be at Sidon, not on the map. Issachar, a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. Issachar is kind of a strange one. Jacob is essentially saying Issachar will be happy to be enslaved. He'll be happy to just be put to work. And he's just happy to be in that situation. Historically, that one's kind of hard to sort out, but, as many times as the northern tribes were enslaved or made captives, I think there's some room in there for that. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan is described as this kind of small but venomous and potent entity. And of course, his tribe is pretty small. His area is pretty small. Samson was a Danite. Samson came from Dan. And there's a couple other stories in Judges about Dan doing this exact kind of behavior, striking at somebody, kind of swiftly and venomously. And then verse 18 is kind of like a pause in the blessings and the promises. Jacob says, "I wait for your salvation, O Lord." There's another verse there. Another translation there, verse 18, I look for your deliverance, O Lord. And people have debated about what that means. I think Jacob he's not necessarily happy about the things he's saying, I don't think. When we talk about inspiration, how does inspiration work? How much of it is true to the person's personality? How much is from God? Because I don't think inspiration is just eyes rolled back in the head, pen on the page, no understanding of what they're doing or what they're saying. It's not quite that. But it's not also just an individual person writing out what they feel either. It's somewhere in between. God has a hand in it, right? And my thought is Jacob loves his sons, and I think he's waiting for salvation, praying for deliverance from God for his children. Because he knows, he has this knowledge now. He knows how hard this is going to be for them. He knows the trials that they're about to face, the sin they're about to go into. And he's in the middle of it, he overcome with the kind of things he's predicted. The kind of things maybe he can see in his mind's eye happening. I wait for your salvation, O Lord. I pray for your deliverance, O Lord. And then he continues. Raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. Apparently this is kind of an alliteration or something in Hebrew. Gad and raiders sounds like kind of the same thing, I guess. So there's kind of a play on words there. But Gad was famous for their kind of military success. 1 Chronicles 5 describes that. Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. I don't know what that means. Something about, maybe Naphtali was more attractive people than everyone else. I don't know. But then he gets to Joseph. And if you count up the verses, just as a kind of a data point, if there's 25 verses of blessings, about half of them are dedicated to Judah and Joseph, because they're more important. I mean, the fact that Naphtali is a doe let loose is probably not as important as the fact that the scepter will never leave Judah's feet. And so, again, here we get to Joseph now. And again, he's going in birth order. And he gets to Joseph. He's a fruitful bough. Again, we have that prosperity imagery, just like the wine. A fruitful bough by a spring. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely, yet his bow remained unmoved. And if you read through these verses about Joseph, what strikes me as different, it's not just that it's positive, because that's different than most of them, but it's that God is mentioned over and over and over in this promise to Joseph. And remember what we emphasized about Joseph as a man and about the way he made decisions and the way he administered to Egypt. He was focused on God more than any of the rest of them, probably more than Jacob himself. Joseph was a God-fearing, a God-centered man. And Jacob highlights that in these promises. By the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by the God of your father, by the Almighty who will bless you, with blessings of heaven above, over and over again, the blessings of your father. He describes Joseph in the terms of being a God-fearing man. And I think that is significant. Because it's this kind of beautiful poem about how much God has blessed Joseph, how important he is to the family, what Joseph has done for the family. On the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. Clearly, Joseph had been set apart, and he had been pulled apart, and he had been enslaved, and he had been, all these bad things had happened. But Joseph is now the second most powerful man in Egypt. He's the one that saved the tribe of Israel, this fledgling tribe. He's the one that allowed them to survive. He's the one that allowed God's promises to survive through God's hand, of course. But Joseph was the vessel to do that. Joseph's faith is without question. And then we get Benjamin, ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey and at evening dividing the spoil. Benjamin, kind of known throughout, and you can read through the Old Testament. Benjamin's always the first ready to go into battle, first to fight, always ready to go. And these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them. And then again, the writer here calls it a blessing, so I guess we're not too far off calling it a blessing. It still seems odd to me. Let's see. Here's an image of another representation of Jacob blessing his sons. And, I like it because they're all kind of, this one guy in the back has his hands behind his back, fidgeting a little bit. Especially after Reuben got his blessing, you can imagine they were all kind of nervous, because most of them had something evil they had done in their life. And I wonder if Judah's the one who wanted to kill Joseph. Judah was the one who impregnated his daughter-in-law because my mistake, I thought she was a Canaanite prostitute. That's not a real redeeming excuse, Judah. And so I wonder if Judah was nervous as well before he went and crouched before his father and received his blessing. And so you wonder, you get the realism of the event, one at a time, going through the motion, stepping up before their father. And, I remember going before my father, if me and my brothers had done something bad, one at a time, we go in the room and you hear the smack of the bell and you wait for yourself to go in and you just dread it more than anything. I can still remember that feeling. And I wonder, these are all grown men, but I wonder if they had that same kind of feeling, one after another, stepping before their father, wondering what their prediction was going to be. Because few of them were good. Few of them were good. And then Jacob tells them, the last thing he says is, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers. And then he references that cave back at Mamre that we talked about last week. That cave where Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, Rebecca, where they were all buried, and Leah, his wife. Of course, he already mentioned Rachel. She couldn't be buried there because they were in the middle of the wilderness, but that's the place where he needs to be buried, and he makes them promise to bury them there. He already has Joseph's word that they're going to bring him back. And there's something interesting here at the end. He says, "Take me so I can be buried with my fathers, buried with my people." But he breathed his last, and he was gathered to his people. And that's a phrase used of the patriarchs quite often. And rather than start kind of a digression on what the intermediate state between life and death is before Jesus comes, I won't go down that path. But I think there is something in here of relief to Jacob when he dies. I was listening to this song the other day. Maybe you're familiar with it. It's an old Scottish song by Jan Bonnie Banks, by Jan Bonnie Braes. I'll take the high road and you take the low road. Well, it's about these two prisoners imprisoned by England during the war with the Bonnie Prince Charles. And the two prisoners they want to get back to Scotland, and one of them is about to be hanged and the other one's about to be released. And so the one that's about to be hanged says, "You take the high road of life. You're going to have to walk back to Scotland. I'm taking the low road through death, but I'll get to Scotland before you." I see a little bit of that here in Jacob. He is now gathered to his people. God promised that he would be gathered to his people. That's what God told him. When he made him walk out of Egypt, when Jacob crossed the boundary at Beersheba and walked towards Egypt, God told him he would be gathered to his people. And there we have it. Drew his feet up into his bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. And that's the end of the last great patriarch. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the last patriarch has now breathed his last. And that concludes chapter 49. Any comments or questions? I think the map I kept referencing the map while I was studying this because I find it pretty interesting to see how things actually played out in Joshua when they start dividing up the land. And again, I wonder if Joshua had these exact verses in mind when they made these decisions, or if that's just how it played out because that was God's plan. I don't know. Maybe a bit of both. All right. We'll end a few minutes early, unless there's any other concluding comments or questions. So next week, again, I'm breaking from ranks a little bit, but next week we'll do all of chapter 50, and that'll conclude the book of Genesis. So we got one more week for Genesis, chapter 50 next week, and then we'll be done. So thanks for your attention this morning.
Thank you.